Thank you, Linda. The great English literary theorist Frank Kermode, in his important critical study, The Sense of an Ending, noted, "The physician Alcmon observed with Aristotle's approval that men die because they cannot join the beginning and the end. What they, the dying men, can do is to imagine a significance for themselves in these unremembered but imaginable events. One of the ways in which they do this is to make objects in which everything is that exists in concord with everything else. And nothing else is, implying that this arrangement mirrors the dispositions of a creator, actual or possible. Such models of the world make tolerable one's moment between beginning and end, or at any rate keep us drowsy emperors awake." And he goes on to invoke Dante, whom I will also draw on quite considerably in this talk. Kermode, "Virgil and Genesis belong to our end-determined fictions. Their stories are placed at what Dante calls the point where all times are present. Il punto a cui tutti I tempi son presenti, or within the shadow of it. It gives each moment its fullness. And although for us the end has perhaps lost its naive imminence, its shadow still lies on the crises of our fictions. We may speak of it as immanent." What I plan to do in this talk is to use the endings of several operas that I discussed to see whether they might throw some light on how the idea of national identity is presented in these works. In their endings, perhaps lies some of their ultimate meaning. We all think we know what the term national identity means, but it's notoriously difficult to nail down. However, it is through the lens of national identity that I wish to discuss these operas. William McIlvaney observed, quote, "Having a national identity is like having an old insurance policy. You know you've got one somewhere, but you're not sure where it is. And if you're honest, you would have to admit you're pretty vague about what all the small print means." This talk draws upon work I've been doing for a forthcoming book on contemporary Australian opera and the way in which I see it reflecting these ongoing debates. The number of recent Australian operas is surprisingly large, and I needed to find a particular focus and thematic coherence to give the book a structure and to make it manageable in terms of which operas to include and which to exclude. It's not a comprehensive or chronological study, nor is it in any sense teleological, and while I certainly make value judgments, I look at the broad picture of how each of the 17 works I discuss contributes a small tile to the large mosaic of how Australia is represented. My Dantean journey commences in 1986 with Richard Mills' Voss, although it's not the first opera I discuss in the book. Voss seems to me to be a watershed as regards Australian opera for several reasons. Patrick White's novel is, if any one novel can be called seminal, just such a work. It is also perhaps the most discussed but least read of all important Australian literary works. But not only the source, but the opera itself has a large ambition, and not for nothing was hailed by some at the time as the great Australian opera, just as the novel was described some 30 years earlier. Of course, there had been some very worthy Australian operas prior to Voss, but almost out of the blue, here was an opera with a musical sweep and breadth of vision that potentially spoke not only to Australians, but to the wider world as well. A CD, a video of the opera followed soon after the premiere, and it was reviewed widely internationally as well. The work had a strong pedigree. The music was by one of the most respected contemporary composers, with a libretto by David Malouf, regarded as one of the preeminent novelists of the time, and still is. While the opera was generally well received, there was a certain puzzlement shown by some critics as regards to its musical idiom. It seemed to move away from Neil's modernist earlier work, but it did seem to herald a new era for Australian opera. So has that era materialized? Well, yes and no. I make Richard Mills' opera Batavia my prologue. In a sense, it's a prehistory of Australia as a nation. Mills' depiction of the wreck of the Dutch East Indiaman off the coast of Western Australia and the depravity among the passengers and crew that resulted is a searching examination of the depths of the human soul. It's very much a Dantean journey into hell as the norms and mores of a civilized society disintegrate under pressure and anarchy takes hold. Those most guilty for the crimes are finally punished, but both the victims and the perpetrators are damaged by the events. There is hope in the work. Two of the guilty are punished by being left on the apparently barren coast and left to fend for themselves. The symbolism of an Adam and Eve is obvious. The journey of the opera starts with the reality of the ship leaving Amsterdam, but as the events unfold, the reality turns into a myth. The final moments of the opera offer a sense of redemption as the commander Pelsit reflects on what has happened. He sings, "What has been is what will be. What is done will again be done. Nothing is new beneath the sun." One of the potent myths of Australia is invoked here. The land can offer the possibility of redemption to those who are prepared to have a go, to invoke a recent Prime Minister. However, in the opera, it is left to the father of the young boys to put all this in context. Next in my operas is Voss. It's the earliest in terms of its composition of all these works, but taking my cue from T.S. Eliot, quote, "In my beginning is my end, I will return to Voss at the end." There's a broad chronological sweep to the operas I examine, although this becomes increasingly blurred in the period after World War II. The late 19th and early 20th century was, of course, a vital formative period in Australia's search for a national identity. The bush looms large in the literature and art of the period. An image of the hardy bushman is prominent. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, it's not Banjo Paterson or Henry Lawson, but Barbara Bainton, a little-known writer of fiction at the turn of the century, who provides the source for a significant opera depicting this period, The Ghost Wife by Jonathan Mills and Dorothy Porter. This is a bleak tale and opera, with no sense of redemption here, but an enormously powerful work. In the bush, a woman is left alone with her child by her abusive husband. A swag man, and certainly not of the jolly kind of the song, arrives, torments her, leaves, and then returns to rape and kill her. Her husband comes home to find the baby, but not the wife. But she is there, now a ghost wife. Mills's music is acerbic and confronting. He uses the wood of the hut in which the action takes place as a potent musical instrument. Its music eminently suitable to this dark story, and I'll play the final few minutes. However, Whitsunday by Brian Howard and Louis Nara has a much more positive ending. An original libretto by Nara, the opera is a fantastical piece which draws on a range of intertextual sources, most notably the quest motive from Mozart's Magic Flute, as well as elements from The Tempest. Nara has described how he took a Watteau painting, as you can see, the embarkation to the island of Cythera, as inspiration, wishing to set the opera in a period of innocence. And for him, the last period of innocence in Australia was just before World War I. Coming at the time of the bicentenary, race relations play an important part in the opera, and though the ending is provisional, it is more hopeful and life-affirming than Mills's work, as a young man, Lawrence, the protagonist, seems to find love with a Kanaka maid, Clara. The opera suggests that through the trials of war, perhaps a future can be found. It had always seemed an anomaly that the First World War had not been directly or even indirectly portrayed in Australian opera. This, of course, was memorably rectified earlier this year by Elliot Geiger and Pierce Wilcox's version of David Malouf's lyrical novella Fly Away Peter. In the novella, the war itself is framed by poetic pastoral scenes on the Gold Coast. Wilcox has fashioned a libretto which uses the main events of Malouf's novella, around which the narratives and the voices of the three protagonists are woven in a continuous musical web. The final moments of the opera find Imogen, the older English woman who has befriended Jim, the bird sanctuary keeper, who's killed in France, mourning his loss, but at the same time discovering the importance of the life lived, however brief. And the final moments of Malouf's novel provide an open-ended text that points towards the future, as you can see in the text on there. The interwar years seem not to have been very fruitful as a subject for opera. and the first major operatic work to engage with the period that I'm aware of immediately after World War II was Summer of the 17th Doll, Richard Mills and Peter Goldworthy's version of the seminal play by Ray Lawler. Full of incident and conflict, this is another bleak work, which itself offers an equivocal ending, as the patterns of the pre-war past are irrevocably changed. Of course, a metaphor for the sweeping changes of the country and the world. Australia was a different country, and the opera concerns the old myths that have lost their potency in this new reality. The idea of mateship is interrogated and perhaps found wanting. The ending of the play is well known, and the opera remains fairly faithful to it. The two men, Rue and Barney, their own relationship and their lives with the others changed forever, go off into an unknown darkness. Of course, the bush, the digger, and World War I are potent symbols and components of an Australian sense of national identity. But Australia is one of the most highly urbanized societies, and cities and their suburbs have also been depicted in a variety of ways in recent opera, including the nation-changing element of mass immigration. Gillian Whitehead's Bride of Fortune is a tragic story of Italian immigrants to Melbourne in the immediate post-war years. Premiered in Perth in 1991, the opera seems to have slipped completely off the radar, yet is a highly effective and moving work. Despite its tragic ending with the violent death of one of the characters, it offers a sense of hope at the end that the country can offer much to its new citizens. But all was not gloom and doom, and there was a cultural renaissance occurring, and perhaps no more potent symbol of this than the building of the Sydney Opera House. This was celebrated in Alan John and Dennis Watkins' opera, The Eighth Wonder, premiered most appropriately in the Opera House in 1996, and revived during the Sydney Olympics. But far be it for me to suggest that this was a purely celebratory work. It reveals all the grubby political machinations that bedeviled the project and depicts the conflicts and ultimate compromises that arose. The work is full of symbols and metaphors. The opera's two main plot lines, the architect and the young singer Alexandra, both increasingly intersect through the course of the events. In my view, this is one of the most important Australian operas, an entertaining yet searching interrogation of national identity, and fittingly will be one of the very few contemporary Australian operas that will actually receive a second production in 2016 on the steps of the Opera House. The opera ends with the same words as it began. Between earth and sky, it's here we live and here we die. And the spirit of man is torn between the earth we know and the sky we've seen. The ending of the opera is the performance of an opera within the opera, the Aztec Serpent. Juan Utzon had studied Mayan temples, and they certainly lie behind the designs for the theatre, as we all know. Sacrifice was central to the function of these buildings, and symbolically, sacrifice plays a large role in the opera. Not only is the architect sacrificed on the altar of political expediency, but the young singer Alexandra and her family have to make personal sacrifices to achieve her dream. But the opera celebrates creativity in all its forms, and I'll play the final couple of moments of the opera within the opera. Potent myths surrounding the bush return with a vengeance in Lindy, Moya Henderson's operatic dramatization of the Lindy Chamberlain case. Probably the most important legal case in Australian history, a moment which shone a devastatingly merciless and unflattering light into the Australian psyche. The amount of material surrounding the case is quite staggering, including film and TV. As divisive as the case itself was, so too did the opera divide critics, and was itself beset by many problems during its gestation period. Even the ending of the opera in the form that emerged in the production and the subsequent recording is substantially different to that originally envisaged by the composer. But Lindy emerges from the ordeal she has undergone, having made her own Dantean journey from darkness into light. This is becoming the Barry Ryan show, I'm afraid. Emigration finds its embodiment in Ian Grandis's adaptation of Tim Winton's novel, The Riders. Many Australians have left the country to seek fame and fortune, particularly in the arts, and it's still an almost obligatory rite of passage. One can often see one's own country more clearly after you have left it. And the novel and the opera is an examination of Australian identity in the late 20th century. The idea of a dominant Australian masculine identity is critically interrogated by Winton in the character of Scully, who is abandoned with his daughter Billy by his wife Jennifer. The reasons for this are never made clear in the novel, as Jennifer is an absent presence throughout. The opera, however, explores some possible reasons for this, and Jennifer appears in the opera, although not to the other characters. After all the heartbreak of a futile Dantean quest by Scully, a sense of hope is implicit in the final moments of the opera, as he finally confronts his own demons, symbolically represented by the mysterious figures of the riders of the title. His life has irrevocably changed, but he has come to terms with his new reality. Suburban comedy and tragedy find their expression in three operas that skewer Australian life. Paul Grabowski set playwright Joanna Murray Smith's original libretto in a jazz-inflected score, which takes a group of upper-middle-class people, Melbourne, I think it is, and manipulates them in an elaborate comedy of manners. Love in the Age of Therapy is a satiric chamber work in the vein of a Stephen Sondheim, with great wit and really charming music. Can't play any of it, I'm afraid. The Great Australian Dream, if there is such a thing, ends in tragedy in Gordon Carey and Louis Naura's version of the infamous Body in a Boot case in Melbourne in 2005. Midnight Sun starts with a suicide and then spirals backward in time to show the events that led to this tragic outcome. And it's another confronting and bleak work. Helen Garner's popular novel, The Children's Bach, made into an opera by Andrew Schultz, offers a sometimes confronting but often comic and ultimately warmly affectionate view of another particular slice of Melbourne life. Music, and particularly the fugue, offers an analogy for the structure of the opera. Music is seen as a metaphor for life and how we attempt, often unsuccessfully, but occasionally successfully, to manage its small and large crises. The opera is concerned with communication and lack thereof. And Billy, the central character, you'll see in a moment, a handicapped boy, cannot speak, but can communicate through song and through music. As one would hope and expect, Indigenous issues have certainly found their way into contemporary Australian opera. Andrew Schultz, who we just heard there, had, with his sister Julianne, looked into the confronting fact of Aboriginal deaths in custody in the immensely powerful work Black River. It later was made into a prize-winning film as well. The most recent opera that deals with Aboriginal issues, although in an allegorical fashion, is The Rabbits, with music by Kate Miller-Heidke, arranged by Ian Grandis, with a libretto based on the children's picture book by John Marsden and Sean Dunn. This work has provoked a lot of comment on the future of opera in Australia. And how a work such as this, with its melange of musical styles as well as performers, might point the way to a possible future. Full of charming and infectious music, it is nonetheless a hard-hitting look at the founding myths of Australia. Deborah Cheatham's opera, Pecan Summer, depicts an historical event, the walk-off of the Aboriginal inhabitants of the Kamaraganja mission in 1939. Cheatham has been tireless in using this work itself as a training ground for young singers and performers, and it's been performed in Melbourne, Perth, and Adelaide, but awaits a Sydney performance. The ending of the work provides one of the most moving and uplifting operatic experiences I can recall. In my end is my beginning. To end, I will look at two of what I consider the most important works of the last 30 years. Brett Dean's Bliss is just about unique in that it is being performed in 3 countries in 2 different productions. a darkly comic adaptation of Peter Carey's early novel. Dean and librettist Amanda Holden take the Dantean elements from the novel and expand them into a full-blown descent into a late 20th century version of hell, but ultimately culminating in the attainment of Elysium. Carey and Dean cast a critical eye on late 20th century consumerist society. Carey's knowledge of the advertising industry provides much material. While the novel was criticized for its lyrical ending, some saw it as a narrative cop-out. Dean seizes upon this aspect, and the opera ends with some of the most lyrical and effective music in the whole score. Although completely different in context and content, musically, there are strong echoes of the tremendous final orchestral moments of Voss. So, are any of these works the long sought-after great Australian opera? Lydia Gurr asked a similar question of American opera and comes to the conclusion, quote, maybe American operas are not meant to last, freed from a philosophy of history that demands the passing of historical time as art's evaluative test. Maybe the point of American opera is not to produce great works. And Alex Ross, reviewing some new American operas, asks a similar question. Are any of these new operas towering masterworks that will alter the course of music history while winning the hearts of millions? People have been asking that loaded question for 100 years. And the way they phrase it almost demands a negative answer. Better to ask whether a new work is strong enough to hold the stage. If it does, it has a future, and the masterpiece sorting can be done by later generations. This is probably the best way of looking at contemporary Australian opera as well. The history of operas that have enjoyed more than one production is dismal indeed. And how are we to fully judge the quality and importance of operas if they only have one production? Apart from the commissioning of new work, perhaps the most important task for opera management is to revisit some of the works of the past. But finally, as promised, back to Voss. Widespread novel ends with a scene set some 20 years after the loss of the expedition and the death of Voss himself. It's the unveiling of a statue of Voss where, almost literally, man becomes myth. Laura, the female protagonist, is an isolated yet important transitional figure who suggests that any future that the settlers might find in this strange land will necessitate their immersion and integration. They have to find a language to describe and understand this country. In the opera's epilogue, and surrounded by the young people of Sydney, she sings, "The air will tell us." Thus the opera remains open-ended and provisional. Might one not say the same about Australian opera and Australian national identity? Thank you.
Very much, Michael. We've got time just for a couple of questions.
Thank you, Michael. It was just great to get such a lovely panoply of works. Obviously, there's something to do with the nature of an ending. We talked about that to some extent. What perhaps surprised me was the number of these that were so very strongly tonal, in sometimes very unproblematic ways, sometimes with little extra trims there. Are these endings as such representative of the musical languages of their works? Or is it a case of the ending being perhaps the moment of resolution when we will get some measure of closure and completion?
Yeah, good question. I think your supposition is pretty much on the money, that the endings do kind of offer some sort of, however provisional, sort of resolution, sense of redemption. There are the exceptions, the Jonathan Mills piece, The Ghost Wife, obviously, and a couple that I didn't have sufficiently good enough material to play. With Sunday, I think is possibly less so, and a few others. But I think that's a kind of an harmonic strategy that a number of composers have used. And I mean, the language of these operas varies enormously. I mean, there's still a strong modernist element in many of the works, but they range right across to, I mean, I just recently saw The Rabbits in Melbourne, and that's music theatre, pop, opera, you name it, everything. Fabulous piece. But yeah, so there's no orthodoxy, I don't think. And maybe that's a good thing.
One more question. Well, if nobody else is going to come up with one, I'm going to. I'm interested in in the way that opera, of course, being a sort of really the ultimate multidisciplinary art form, and I think very often we approach endings with a kind of textual orientation, but it seems to me that all of them really, well, the text was structuring it, but in very different ways. I wonder if you have some parting remarks about the importance of the libretto in these.
Yeah, look, very much so. I think most of the libretti that these operas, that structure these operas have that sense, obviously, of some kind of resolution. Generally, the music does reinforce that. But the one opera, again, one I didn't play, the Love in the Age of Therapy, has a wonderfully kind of strange ending. You have this androgynous character who moves through the whole opera as a kind of a Greek chorus commenting on the follies of these upper middle class Melburnians. And it's wonderful. It's an hysterical piece. And but right at the end, he suddenly kind of throws everything up into the air in a sense, and it's all what had been very much a sort of comic piece suddenly takes on quite a not a tragic. It's not. There's no tragedy in the piece, but certainly a much darker element. So some of the endings are quite surprising, I think. But on the whole, I mean, like Bliss, like Voss, what had been very confronting music and events, essentially, generally seem to find some kind of resolution. Again, it's a resolution that is ambiguous in many cases, open-ended, but yeah, I guess, I mean, that's the sense of giving a work its structure. And one of my particular favorites, the children's Bach Andrew Schultz piece, I think that sort of ending where it just sort of fades out into nothingness, I think is highly successful in that sense. And so, yeah, but what I would say, my parting sort of comment would be, they're also varied, these pieces. There's not one model that I could say sort of sets a sort of a kind of structure or some kind of way forward. Voss, in a sense, I think is very important work, but it sort of didn't really have heirs, if one can put it that way. And I think the opera world now, not only in Australia, but certainly everywhere else, is so fractured in terms of style and fractured in a good sense, I think, personally, that there's no sort of paradigm that one can say this is where these works fit. And certainly the Rabbits is, I think, a really important work in the sense of where, I mean, it's not to everyone's taste, but I think it's an important work to show where opera can go and draw in a large audience. I saw it in Melbourne a few weeks ago in a theatre half full of children and the rest adults, and they loved it. And, it's nice to see opera in that sort of environment. So, yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic, I guess. But it's, for me, the big, as I just alluded to, the big issue is some of these works, not all of them, must be revisited, I think. And that's the bottom line.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's been a real pleasure to listen to your thoughts as well as to the music. And I'd like you to all join me in thanking Michael very much.